Throughout the ages, whispers of the future have echoed across civilizations, visions carved into stone, hidden in sacred texts, or spoken by those believed to touch the divine. These ancient prophecies weren't just stories. They shaped empires, guided kings, and foretold events so precise, it's as if time itself bent to their words. Think about that for a moment. Long before satellites, before computers, even before the printing press, people saw glimpses of what was to come with startling accuracy. And what's even more chilling, many of those predictions didn't just come true, they unfolded in ways that defy rational explanation. Today, we're diving deep into 25 of the most unsettling prophecies that history can't ignore. From the fall of mighty cities to the rise of world-changing leaders, these weren't vague guesses or lucky strikes. They were detailed, often terrifyingly specific, and left those who witnessed their fulfillment questioning everything they thought they knew about fate. Imagine standing in the shadow of an ancient temple, reading words etched thousands of years ago, words that describe events happening right now in our lifetime. That's the power of these prophecies. They bridge time, connecting our modern world to the mysteries of the past in ways that still send shivers down the spine. But this isn't just about the eerie thrill of prediction. It's about the bigger question: how could someone in the dusty streets of Babylon or the misty highlands of Scotland see fragments of our reality with such clarity? Whether you believe in divine intervention, lost knowledge, or something science hasn't yet uncovered, one thing's certain: these stories demand attention. So settle in, because what follows isn't just a list. It's a journey through time where the line between prophecy and history blurs, and where the past might just hold the key to understanding the future in ways you've never imagined. Ready to uncover the truth? Let's begin. Long before Alexander the Great marched his armies across continents, a single prophecy set his destiny in motion, one spoken in the hallowed halls of the Oracle of Delphi. The story begins with Alexander's father, King Philip of Macedon, who journeyed to the temple seeking answers about his future. The oracle's words were cryptic yet electrifying. Your son will be a lion, unstoppable in his hunger, and the world itself will tremble before him. At the time, no one could grasp just how literal those words would become. But here's where it gets fascinating. Ancient historians like Plutarch recorded that the oracle didn't just stop there. She whispered of a conqueror who would untie the knot no man could loosen, a direct nod to the famous Gordian knot, a tangled puzzle said to hold the fate of Asia. Years later, when Alexander stood before that very knot, he didn't bother untying it. He sliced it in half with his sword, fulfilling the prophecy in the boldest way imaginable. It wasn't just a display of brute force, it was a moment that echoed back to Delphi, as if the oracle had seen his defiance centuries before it happened. And then there's the eerie precision of her predictions about his battles. She spoke of a king who would ride the wind, and sure enough, Alexander's lightning-fast campaigns, covering thousands of miles in mere years, left his enemies breathless. Even his death seemed foreshadowed. The oracle warned that the lion would meet his match not in battle, but in the heat of Babylon, a chilling hint at his sudden fever in that very city at the height of his power. Coincidence, maybe, but when you line up every detail, the knot, the conquests, even the place of his death, it's hard to dismiss the uncanny accuracy of those ancient words. What makes this prophecy so compelling isn't just its fulfillment, but its defiance of probability. The oracle didn't deal in vague horoscopes. She painted a portrait of a specific man with specific actions in a specific time, and history followed her script to the letter. Whether it was divine insight or something else entirely, one thing's clear: the world changed because someone, somewhere, saw Alexander coming long before he ever drew his sword. From the moment Alexander heard the prophecy, it became the invisible hand guiding his every move. The words of the oracle didn't just predict his future, they shaped it, fueling an unshakable belief that he was destined for the impossible. Imagine the sheer psychological power of knowing deep in your bones that the gods themselves had foretold your victory. That certainty turned bold gambles into calculated risks and audacious maneuvers into inevitabilities. Take his march into Persia, for example. Facing an empire far larger and wealthier than his own, lesser commanders might have hesitated, but Alexander. He charged forward not as a man hoping for triumph, but as one who already knew it was his. This unyielding confidence rippled through his army. Soldiers who might have doubted their young king instead followed him with fanatical loyalty, convinced they were part of something divine. When they stood at the banks of the Granicus River, outnumbered and exhausted, it wasn't just strategy that won the day, it was the whispered legend of the lion who couldn't lose. Even in moments that seemed like madness, like the siege of Tyre or the crossing of the Hindu Kush, Alexander's actions carried the weight of prophecy. His enemies didn't just face a military genius, they faced a man who believed utterly that the world was his to claim. And then there's the darker side of that certainty. The same prophecy that drove him to greatness also sowed the seeds of his downfall. Convinced of his invincibility, he pushed further and harder than any mortal should, ignoring warnings, dismissing fatigue, treating loyalty and caution as weaknesses. The fever that took him in Babylon, it wasn't just illness. It was the reckoning of a man who'd been told he was unstoppable until suddenly, cruelly, he wasn't. The oracle's words had given him everything, but they also stripped away the one thing that might have saved him, the ability to doubt. Yet even in death, the prophecy held power. His empire fractured, yes, but his legend only grew, spreading across cultures and centuries until Alexander became less a man and more a symbol, precisely as the oracle had foreseen. The lion's hunger didn't end with his life. It echoed through history, proving that some prophecies don't just predict the future, they create it. While Alexander's prophecy came from a single oracle, Rome's fate was written in an entire library of divine warnings, the mysterious Sibylline Books. These ancient texts, guarded by Rome's most trusted priests, weren't just scrolls, they were the empire's emergency hotline to the gods, and one prediction in particular would alter the course of history. A chilling warning about a coming storm from across the sea, a war so brutal it would push Rome to the brink. The enemy, Carthage, the prophecy, a blueprint for survival hidden in riddles. The books spoke of a serpent from the waves that would rise to challenge Rome not once but 3 times, a clear nod to the 3 devastating Punic Wars. But here's the twist: the Sibylline prophecy didn't just predict the conflict, it dictated Rome's strategy. When Carthage General Hannibal crossed the Alps with his war elephants, an unthinkable maneuver, Rome's leaders turned to the books for guidance. The priests deciphered a cryptic instruction: only when foreign soil touches Roman grain will the serpent weaken. This led to Scipio Africanus' daring invasion of North Africa, forcing Hannibal to abandon Italy and face defeat on Carthaginian soil. A tactical masterstroke, absolutely, but also a move ripped straight from the pages of prophecy. Even more startling is how the books foresaw Rome's ultimate victory. They described a city of salt and ashes, a phrase historians later linked to the total destruction of Carthage after the Third Punic War. Roman troops didn't just conquer the city, they scoured it from the earth, sowing fields with salt so nothing could grow exactly as the ancient words had hinted. The level of specificity here isn't just eerie, it raises uncomfortable questions. Did Rome follow the prophecy, or did the prophecy create the outcome? After all, the Sibylline warnings weren't passive predictions. They were catalysts shaping decisions from Senate chambers to battlefields. What sets this prophecy apart is its institutional power. Unlike Alexander's personal oracle, the Sibylline Books were a state secret, consulted in moments of crisis like a divine playbook. Their predictions weren't left to chance, they became policy. And that's the real spine tingler. These weren't vague musings about dark times ahead. They were actionable intelligence from the gods themselves, directing one of history's greatest empires through its most existential threats. Whether divine insight or brilliantly crafted strategy, the result was the same. Rome didn't just survive the serpent's bite, it crushed the serpent's head. Centuries before flames would engulf London's wooden streets, a French apothecary turned prophet penned words that would freeze the blood of future generations. Nostradamus, whose cryptic quatrains have baffled and terrified readers for 500 years, described a scene so vivid it's as if he stood in the smoke-choked alleys himself. The blood of the just will burn within London's walls, consumed in 66 by fire 3 times 20. At first glance, it reads like another of his enigmatic riddles, but unpack the numbers, and the hairs on your neck might stand on end. 1966 was no ordinary year for London. It was the year the city burned. Historians have pored over every syllable of that quatrain, revealing layers of precision hidden beneath the poetry. The phrase "fire 3 times 20" points uncannily to the fire's duration. 60 hours of relentless destruction, from a baker's oven on Pudding Lane to the ashes of 13,000 homes. Even more chilling, Nostradamus didn't just predict the year, he hinted at the cause. His mention of the blood of the just aligns with later theories that the fire began near Fish Street Hill, where a monument to the Great Fire now stands, a stone's throw from the old slaughterhouses where the blood of butchered animals might have fueled the blaze. Coincidence stretches thin when you consider the prophecy's next line. The ancient lady will fall from her high place, a possible nod to St. Paul's Cathedral, its lead roof melting like wax in the inferno. But here's where skeptics and believers clash. Some argue the prophecy is too vague, that 66 could reference any century, and fire 3 times 20 might be pure numerology. Yet the counterargument is irresistible. Nostradamus published this in 1566, exactly a century before the fire. Was he seeing a literal future, or did his words plant the seed of destiny itself? After all, Londoners in 1666 knew the prophecy. Did it shape their panic, their decisions, even their failure to stop the flames? Perhaps the most unsettling detail isn't in the quatrain at all, but in the aftermath. Nostradamus wrote that the fire would cleanse the city of its pestilence. The Great Fire did exactly that, erasing the rat-infested slums that had harbored the plague the year before, killing 1 in 5 Londoners. A grim silver lining foretold with surgical precision. Whether you see divine vision or dazzling luck, one thing's undeniable. When the flames finally died, Londoners didn't just stare at the ashes. They stared at a 400-year-old book and wondered how a man who'd never set foot in their city could describe its doom like a playwright scripting tragedy. The line between prophecy and history had never felt so thin. The Mayan civilization left behind more than towering pyramids and intricate calendars. They left warnings etched into stone, warnings that spoke of strangers from across the sea. Centuries before Spanish sails appeared on the horizon, the Popol Vuh, the sacred Mayan text, contained a passage that reads differently now than it ever could have to its original readers. The lords of the East will come, bearers of the sun and the cross, and with them will come the end of all things known. At the time, it might have seemed like myth. By the 1500s, it became a horrifying reality. What makes this prophecy so unsettling is its specificity. The Mayans didn't just predict foreign invaders, they described them. The Chilam Balam, another key text, spoke of men with faces like the moon, a possible reference to pale-skinned Spaniards who would arrive riding beasts like deer, an uncanny nod to horses, animals entirely unknown in the Americas before Columbus. Even more chilling, the texts warned that these strangers would wield sticks that spit thunder, a description too precise to dismiss when you consider the conquistadors' firearms. But the prophecy's real power lay in its timing. The Mayan long count calendar, often misunderstood as predicting the end of the world in 2012, actually marked cycles of transformation. Scholars now believe one of these cycles aligned eerily with the arrival of Hernan Cortés in 1519. The Aztecs, who shared cultural ties with the Maya, had their own omens, like the fiery comet seen for months before the Spanish landed, mirroring Mayan texts that spoke of a serpent of fire in the sky heralding destruction. Yet the most haunting detail isn't in the predictions themselves, but in how they played out. The Mayan prophecy described the invaders as both destroyers and unwitting pawns of fate. Cortés, driven by gold and glory, didn't realize he was stepping into a story written long before his birth. When he allied with the Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies of the Aztecs, he fulfilled another layer of the prophecy. The old hatreds will boil, and the strangers will walk upon their heat. In other words, the Spanish didn't conquer alone. They exploited existing fractures, just as the ancient texts foretold. Was this mere coincidence or something deeper? The Mayans, master astronomers and mathematicians, might have recognized patterns, historical cycles where power always falls, always shifts. Or perhaps, in recording their fears of the unknown, they inadvertently wrote a script that later men would follow. Either way, the result was the same. An empire fell, not to blind chance, but to a prophecy that saw its own fulfillment coming from across the ocean, centuries before the first ship ever set sail. High in the Himalayas, where the air itself feels sacred, monks once whispered of a time when their spiritual leader would walk a path no Dalai Lama had ever walked before. Ancient Tibetan texts, hidden for centuries in remote monasteries, spoke with eerie clarity about the 14th Dalai Lama's exile, long before Chinese tanks rolled into Lhasa. One passage in particular from the Kalachakra Tantra reads like a dispatch from the future. When the iron bird flies and horses run on wheels, the Tibetan people will be scattered like ants across the world, and the Dharma will find refuge in the land of the red robes. At first glance, this reads like poetic mysticism, but break it down and the precision is staggering. The iron bird flies, the airplanes that carried the Dalai Lama to safety in 1959. Horses run on wheels, the military vehicles that rumbled through Tibet's valleys during the invasion. Even the land of the red robes fits with uncanny accuracy. India, where Buddhist monks' saffron-colored robes found sanctuary after the exile. And scattered like ants, the Tibetan diaspora now spans the globe from Dharamshala to New York. But here's what makes this prophecy truly extraordinary. It wasn't just about events, but about choices. The texts warned that the Dalai Lama would face a crossroads, a test of compassion in the hour of the wolf. That's exactly what happened when he fled Tibet. Rather than urging resistance, he chose non-violence, a decision that shaped his legacy as a global peace icon. The prophecy didn't just predict his exile, it foresaw the philosophy that would define it. The political undertones are impossible to ignore. Tibet had been a theocracy, isolated from the modern world, yet these texts seem to anticipate its collision with 20th century geopolitics. Some scholars argue the Kalachakra isn't prophecy at all, but a sophisticated analysis of historical cycles, a warning about empires rising and falling. Others point to the Dalai Lama's own comments, suggesting he saw his exile not as a tragedy, but as part of a larger spiritual unfolding. Perhaps the most haunting detail lies in what the texts didn't say. There's no promise of return, no neat resolution, just a cryptic line about the snow lion sleeping until the earth turns white again. Whether that means Tibet's eventual freedom or something more metaphorical, one thing's certain: centuries ago, in the flickering light of butter lamps, someone wrote a story that's still being lived today. Not as myth, but as history. Buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, a set of ancient clay tablets held a secret that would rewrite history, not as kings often do, with swords and fire, but with an act of mercy so unexpected it stunned the ancient world. The Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879 amid the ruins of Babylon, isn't just a relic, it's a prophecy fulfilled. The tablet's inscription, written in the voice of the gods, declares, A king will rise from the east, a liberator who will break the chains of the captive and restore the temples of the oppressed. At the time, Babylon was the mightiest empire on earth, ruled by the tyrant Nabonidus. No one could have imagined his downfall would come at the hands of a foreigner, Cyrus the Great, precisely as the gods had foretold. What makes this prophecy so extraordinary is its inversion of conquest. Cyrus didn't just defeat Babylon in 539 BC, he did something unprecedented. Instead of slaughtering the defeated or enslaving their people, he freed them. The cylinder records his decree allowing exiled nations, including the Jews, to return home and rebuild their temples. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was the exact scenario the tablets had described centuries earlier. A conqueror who'd unlock the gates of bondage, even more startling. The prophecies, likely written during Nabonidus' reign, criticized his neglect of Babylon's gods, and Cyrus positioned himself as their chosen instrument, citing divine will as his mandate. But the real spine-tingler lies in the details. The tablets spoke of a king who'd enter Babylon without battle, a line historians now link to Cyrus' ingenious strategy. When his armies reached the city, they diverted the Euphrates River, slipping through the water gates at night while Babylon's elite celebrated a festival. By dawn, the empire had fallen not with a siege, but with a trick straight out of prophecy. And then there's the Jewish connection. The Hebrew prophet Isaiah, writing a century before Cyrus' birth, named him explicitly as the Anointed One who'd free the Jews, a title usually reserved for their own kings. For a foreign ruler to be called Messiah was unheard of, yet Cyrus' actions matched Isaiah's predictions down to the letter. The return to Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, even the funding from the Persian treasury. Two cultures, two sets of prophecies, one man at the center of it all. Was this divine orchestration or brilliant propaganda? Some scholars argue Cyrus used existing prophecies to legitimize his rule, casting himself as Babylon's destined liberator. Others point to the eerie alignment of predictions across cultures, as if history itself had been scripted in advance. Either way, the result reshaped the ancient world. Cyrus didn't just fulfill prophecy, he redefined what power could be, proving that sometimes the most shocking prediction isn't of destruction but of mercy. Cyrus didn't just conquer Babylon, he rewrote the rules of empire. The prophecy carved into that clay cylinder didn't merely predict his victory, it became the foundation of his reign, a masterstroke of political and spiritual branding. Think about it, by casting himself as the god's chosen liberator, Cyrus transformed from foreign invader to rightful ruler overnight. The people of Babylon, weary of Nabonidus' neglect, welcomed him not as an enemy but as the fulfillment of divine will. This wasn't just clever PR, it was a blueprint for power that echoed far beyond his lifetime. The impact on Persian history was seismic. Cyrus' successors, from Darius to Xerxes, leaned heavily into this prophetic legacy, portraying themselves as heirs to a celestial mandate. The Achaemenid Empire's tolerance for diverse cultures, a radical concept in the ancient world, traced directly back to the cylinder's promise of restored temples and freed peoples. Scholar interpretations vary, but one thing's clear. The prophecy gave Persia something rare among ancient superpowers: legitimacy in the eyes of the conquered. Even Alexander the Great, when he later toppled the Persians, made a point of honoring Cyrus' tomb, as if acknowledging the enduring spell of that ancient prediction. For the Jewish people, the prophecy's ripple effects were nothing short of transformative. Isaiah's vision of Cyrus as Messiah wasn't just poetic flattery, it saved a nation. When Cyrus decreed the Jews could return to Jerusalem, he didn't just grant permission, he funded their pilgrimage and temple reconstruction from the royal treasury. This single act preserved Jewish identity against the tides of assimilation, ensuring the survival of a faith that would shape civilizations. Modern archaeologists still debate whether Cyrus genuinely believed in these prophecies or simply weaponized them, but the result was undeniable. a covenant between Persian kings and Jewish leaders that lasted generations. Perhaps most fascinating is how this ancient prophecy blurred the line between politics and destiny. The cylinder's language deliberately mirrored older Mesopotamian traditions where kings were called by the gods, but Cyrus elevated it to new heights. His edicts weren't just proclamations, they were performances of predestined authority. When he claimed Marduk, Babylon's chief god, had scanned all lands for a righteous ruler, he wasn't merely justifying his invasion, he was scripting reality itself. Yet the deepest legacy lies in what this prophecy reveals about human nature. People crave narratives where power isn't arbitrary, where chaos bends toward meaning. Cyrus understood this instinctively. By anchoring his reign in prophecy, he didn't just rule an empire, he offered a story, one where conquest wasn't about brute force but cosmic order. Even today, 2,500 years later, that story resonates. From modern Iran's pride in Cyrus to diplomatic speeches invoking his tolerance, the prophecy did more than predict history. It became history, proving that sometimes the most powerful conquests aren't of land but of imagination. Deep in the red rock mesas of Arizona, the Hopi people have safeguarded prophecies passed down through countless generations, stories not carved in stone, but woven into the very fabric of their spiritual traditions. Among these, one vision stands out with spine-chilling relevance: the prophecy of the blue star Kachina, a celestial messenger whose arrival would herald an age of unimaginable transformation. The elders spoke of a time when the earth would tremble with inventions, when paths of light would connect all nations, and when humanity would face a choice between harmony and destruction. To ancient ears, these words might have sounded like myth. Today, they read like a dispatch from our own reality. The blue star Kachina itself is described as a radiant being descending from the skies, an image some interpret as a metaphor for advanced technology or even extraterrestrial contact. But the prophecy's true power lies in its details. The Hopi foretold houses of metal moving without horses, a near-perfect depiction of automobiles, and voices traveling through the air, an uncanny nod to radio waves and smartphones. Even more striking is the warning that accompanies these advancements. When the blue star dances in the heavens, the children will forget the songs of their ancestors and the water will turn bitter. It's hard not to see the parallels: vanishing indigenous languages in the digital age, or the pollution choking modern rivers. Yet this isn't just a tale of doom. The Hopi prophecies, like many indigenous traditions, emphasize cycles rather than endpoints. They describe a great purification, a period of upheaval where humanity must confront the consequences of imbalanced climate change, social fragmentation, the erosion of tradition. But woven through these warnings is a thread of hope, the promise that those who remember the old ways, who live in harmony with the earth, will help birth a new world from the ashes of the old. What makes the Blue Star prophecy so compelling isn't just its accuracy, but its universality. Unlike narrow predictions tied to specific events, the Hopi vision speaks to the fundamental tension between progress and preservation, a struggle every modern society faces. When elders talk of the two paths, one leading to renewal and the other to ruin, they're not describing fate but choice. That's the heart of this prophecy, a reminder that technology alone won't save or doom us. It's how we wield it, grounded in wisdom or driven by greed, that will determine whether the blue star's dance lights our way forward or seals our descent. Perhaps the most profound lesson lies in the timing. The Hopi didn't set dates for these events. They spoke of signs, of conditions being met. And in an era where AI reshapes cultures overnight and satellites monitor melting glaciers, those signs feel less like ancient stories and more like a mirror held up to our present. The prophecy doesn't offer easy answers, but something far more valuable, a chance to ask while there's still time which path we're really walking. The Book of Revelation, that final mysterious chapter of the Christian Bible, reads like a fever dream of beasts, plagues, and collapsing empires. But beneath its vivid symbolism lies a prophecy so precise it sent chills down the spines of historians. Written during the reign of Emperor Domitian, when Rome seemed invincible, its verses whispered of a coming collapse. Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons. To early Christians, Babylon was code for Rome itself, the empire persecuting them. And what's astonishing isn't just that Rome fell, but how closely its downfall mirrored the apocalyptic vision penned 3 centuries earlier. Take the infamous 7 heads of the beast, often interpreted as Rome's 7 hills. The text warns that one head would appear, mortally wounded, yet healed, a possible nod to Emperor Nero, whose suicide sparked rumors he'd return. When the imperial line fractured after Nero's death, Rome nearly tore itself apart before stabilizing under Vespasian. But the prophecy's real punch comes later. The kings of the earth will weep as they see the smoke of her burning. Fast forward to 410 AD, when the Visigoths sacked Rome. Eyewitness accounts describe fires so vast, the smoke darkened the sky for days, exactly as Revelation had foretold. Even the economic collapse lines up. Revelation speaks of merchants mourning because no one buys their cargoes anymore, listing goods like gold, ivory, and fine linen, luxuries Rome imported from its provinces. When the empire's trade routes crumbled under barbarian invasions, markets that once thrived on Mediterranean commerce went silent. And then there's the eeriest detail of all. The prophecies claim that Rome would fall in 1 hour. Historians note that the city's political dominance didn't erode slowly. It shattered almost overnight when Emperor Romulus Augustulus was deposed in 476, marking the official end of the Western Empire. But here's what makes this prophecy stand out. It wasn't passive prediction. It fueled resistance. Early Christians circulated these verses as underground encouragement, a promise that their oppressors wouldn't last. By the time Alaric's Goths breached the gates, many saw it not as tragedy but fulfillment. Whether divine foresight or shrewd political critique, Revelation did something remarkable. It turned Rome's greatest weakness into a story written long before the empire ever admitted it was mortal. The empire that once mocked prophets became the very proof of their words. Emperor Qin Shi Huang united China under a single rule, built the Great Wall, and left behind an army of terracotta warriors to guard his tomb. Yet buried within the same era's text lies a prophecy that saw through his grandeur to predict his dynasty's shocking collapse. The ancient Chinese text records of the Grand Historian recounts a chilling omen whispered among scholars. The house of Qin will burn brightly, but its light will last no longer than a morning dew. At the height of the emperor's power, this seemed unthinkable. The Qin dynasty had crushed rival states, standardized writing, and consolidated authority with ruthless efficiency. But the prophecy wasn't just poetic pessimism, it was a precise warning about the cost of tyranny. The clues lay in the emperor's own obsessions. Obsessed with immortality, Qin Shi Huang dispatched expeditions to find mythical elixirs and drank mercury-laced potions, ironically hastening his death. The texts warned that he who seeks to conquer time will be conquered by it, a line that took on grim meaning when the emperor died suddenly during a tour of his empire in 210 BC. His advisors, terrified of unrest, concealed his death for weeks, even propping his corpse in a carriage to maintain the illusion of life. But the prophecy had already foreseen the chaos to come. When the tiger's roar falls silent, the wolves will tear his house apart. And tear they did. Within months, revolts erupted across the realm. The emperor's son, Qin Shi, proved tragically unprepared, manipulated by a scheming chancellor who exacerbated the crises. Peasant uprisings like the famous Dazixiang rebellion exposed the brittleness of a regime built on fear. The prophecy's most haunting detail, its timeline. The Qin dynasty lasted just 15 years after unification, roughly a morning dew in the grand sweep of history. Even the terracotta army, meant to protect the emperor in the afterlife, couldn't shield his legacy from the truth. oppression, as the ancients foretold, plants the seeds of its own destruction. What makes this prophecy so compelling isn't just its accuracy, but its moral clarity. The texts didn't merely predict the kin's fall, they explained it. A ruler who builds walls around his people, one passage reads, builds his own prison. Qin Shi Huang's Great Wall, while awe-inspiring, drained resources and lives, fueling resentment. His infamous burning of books and burying of scholars alienated the intellectual class, ensuring no loyal advisors remained to steer his heir. The prophecy framed these not as isolated missteps, but as symptoms of a deeper sickness, the belief that power could defy the will of heaven itself. Yet there's an ironic twist to this tale. While the Qin dynasty crumbled, its foundational reforms, standardized weights, unified script, centralized rule outlasted it, shaping China for millennia. The prophecy, in a sense, was both right and incomplete. It saw the dynasty's doom but underestimated its lasting imprint. Perhaps that's the real lesson here. Even the clearest visions of the future can't capture every ripple in time's river. The Qin burned brightly, just as foretold, but its embers still glow in the unlikeliest places. The Vikings didn't just fear the end of the world, they painted it in vivid, brutal detail. The prophecy of Ragnarok, preserved in the Poetic Edda and Prose Edda, reads like a script for the ultimate battle, gods and giants clashing, the sun swallowed by a monstrous wolf, and the earth itself sinking into the sea. But what's startling isn't just the drama of this Norse apocalypse, it's how closely its imagery mirrors the crises we face today. The ancients spoke of a great winter called Fimbulvetter, 3 years of unrelenting cold where brother would turn against brother, a scenario that feels uncomfortably familiar in an age of climate instability and societal fractures. Dig deeper and the parallels grow even sharper. The prophecy describes the serpent Jörmungandr, who lies coiled in the ocean until the final days, when it will rise and poison the skies with its venom. Swap serpent for carbon emissions and venom for pollution, and suddenly this myth feels less like fantasy and more like a dire ecological warning. Even the aftermath of Ragnarok carries eerie resonance. After the devastation, the Eddas tell of a new world rising from the waters, fertile and green, where a handful of survivors rebuild. It's a vision that echoes modern conversations about resilience and renewal in the face of climate collapse. But Ragnarok isn't just about environmental doom. It's a prophecy of cyclical violence, of ancient grudges erupting into total war. The trickster Loki, bound and tortured for his crimes, breaks free to lead an army of the dead, a narrative that mirrors modern fears of unresolved injustices boiling over into chaos. The gods of Asgard, for all their power, can't avoid their fate, they can only meet it with courage. There's a raw honesty in this Norse worldview, a recognition that some crises are inevitable, and what matters isn't preventing the end but facing it with honor. What makes Ragnarok uniquely haunting is its lack of easy redemption. Unlike other apocalyptic prophecies with clear messiahs or divine intervention, the Norse version offers no savior, just a reckoning. The gods fight knowing they'll perish, and the world burns not to punish the wicked, but because cycles of destruction and rebirth are woven into the fabric of existence. It's a perspective that resonates deeply in our era of climate anxiety and geopolitical tension. The Vikings didn't sugarcoat reality, they stared into the abyss and carved what they saw into legend. Yet within this grim prophecy lies an unexpected thread of hope. Ragnarok isn't the end, it's a reset. The surviving gods, along with 2 human survivors, emerge to repopulate a cleansed earth. This isn't nihilism, it's a stark reminder that even in collapse there's potential for renewal. The Norse didn't waste time pleading for deliverance. They prepared, they fought, and they trusted that whatever came after would be worth the struggle. In a world grappling with its own looming twilight of the gods, that Viking stubbornness might be the most prophetic lesson of all. Today's headlines often feel like pages torn straight from the Norse prophecies, rising sea levels mirroring the great flood of Ragnarok, while wildfires and superstorms echo Fimbulvet's endless winter. Scientists warn of climate tipping points with the same urgency as Odin preparing for the final battle, and the parallels go deeper than poetic coincidence. When glaciers melt at unprecedented rates, releasing ancient viruses just as Jörmungandr's venom was said to poison the skies, it's hard not to wonder if the Vikings glimpsed more than myth. Geopolitical tensions add another layer to this uncanny resemblance. The prophecy described alliances fracturing, with brother turning on brother, a scenario playing out in modern trade wars, cyber conflicts, and the unraveling of international treaties. Like the gods of Asgard, world leaders today face threats that defy borders, from pandemics to AI-driven disinformation, yet struggle to unite against them. Even the symbolism of Loki's return, chaos breaking free from ancient restraints, finds echoes in the resurgence of long-suppressed conflicts from the Balkans to the South China Sea. But here's where Ragnarok's wisdom cuts deepest: its cyclical nature. Unlike linear apocalypses promising final judgment, the Norse vision insists on regeneration. After the fires cool, new life sprouts from the ashes. Modern ecologists point to this same principle, documenting how forests regrow after wildfires and coral reefs adapt to warming seas. The prophecy's real power lies in its refusal to see collapse as an end, only a brutal transition. Indigenous activists and climate scientists alike now channel this perspective, framing crises not as doomsdays but as catalysts for systemic change. Perhaps the most unsettling parallel is the role of human agency. The Vikings believed Ragnarok was inevitable, but their sagas glorified those who fought with honor anyway. Today, as we stare down our own looming disasters, that stubborn resolve feels less like fatalism and more like a survival strategy. The prophecies didn't exist to paralyze, they were calls to courage, reminding us that even in twilight, there's dignity in how we face the storm. And if the ancients were right about the storm itself, maybe we should heed their lessons on weathering it too. The Aztec Empire stood at the height of its power when whispers of an ancient prophecy began to ripple through Tenochtitlan, one that would unravel everything. Centuries before Spanish sails appeared on the horizon, the god Quetzalcoatl had vanished with a promise. He would return one day from the eastern sea, pale-skinned and bearded, to reclaim his kingdom. For Emperor Moctezuma II, this wasn't just myth, it was a ticking clock, and when Cortés landed in 1519, that clock struck midnight. The parallels were terrifyingly precise. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of wisdom and wind, had been exiled after a clash with dark forces, vowing to come back in the year 1 read on the Aztec calendar, a date that just happened to align with Cortés' arrival. Spanish chroniclers later recorded how Moctezuma's spies brought reports of towers moving on water, ships, and men clad in metal conquistador armor, matching descriptions of Quetzalcoatl's promised retinue. Even Cortés landing near Veracruz fit the prophecy's details, the very region where the god had supposedly departed centuries earlier. But the real tragedy lay in Moctezuma's response. Paralysis gripped him. Was this divine fate or a cruel trick? Instead of crushing the Spaniards at the coast, he sent envoys with lavish gifts, gold, jewels, ceremonial robes, as though testing Cortés' identity. The Spanish captain, no stranger to opportunity, leaned into the role. He accepted the tribute like a returning sovereign, even donning Quetzalcoatl's sacred colors. With every hesitant move Moctezuma made, Cortés tightened his grip, exploiting the emperor's spiraling doubt. Yet the prophecy's darkest twist wasn't its accuracy, it was its ambiguity. Later scholars uncovered hints that Quetzalcoatl's return might have symbolized renewal, not submission. Some Aztec texts describe the god bringing an end to human sacrifice, a practice Cortés hypocritically condemned while slaughtering thousands himself. Others suggest Moctezuma may have initially seen the Spaniards as allies against rival cities, only realizing his mistake when it was too late. By the time the emperor faced Cortés in his own palace, the psychological damage was done. Moctezuma, once a formidable ruler, became a prisoner of his own convictions, vacillating between defiance and deference until his empire crumbled around him. The prophecy didn't just predict his downfall, it weaponized his faith, turning cultural memory into a Trojan horse. And in that cruel irony lies the most haunting lesson of all. Sometimes, the prophecies that destroy us aren't the ones written in stone, but the ones we carve into our own mind. Beneath the shadow of the Great Sphinx, a young prince once slept and woke to a vision that would change the course of Egyptian history. The dream stela, a slab of pink granite erected between the Sphinx's paws, tells the story of Thutmose IV's divine encounter. At the time, he was just a minor royal far down the line of succession, but the gods had other plans. In the heat of midday, the Sphinx himself, embodiment of the sun god Ra-Horakhti, spoke to the sleeping prince, choking on the desert sands that had buried him up to his neck. "Clear my body," the statue rasped, "and I will make you pharaoh." This wasn't just a dream, it was political dynamite. The stela's inscription describes Thutmose acting immediately, marshalling workers to excavate the Sphinx from centuries of encroaching sand. But here's where history gets provocative. Scholars examining the timeline found something peculiar. The Sphinx was likely already unearthed before Thutmose's dream. So why stage such an elaborate prophecy? Because young Thutmose had a problem. His path to the throne was at best uncertain. Some records suggest he wasn't even the crown prince when his father died. But in ancient Egypt, divine endorsement trumped bloodline. By claiming the Sphinx handpicked him, Thutmose didn't just secure kingship, he rewrote history itself. The genius of the dream stela lies in its details. The Sphinx didn't promise vague blessings, he offered specific terms. Thutmose would rule as beloved of Ra, his legitimacy unshakable if he restored the god's monument. This quid pro quo mirrored realpolitik. The priesthood of Ra, powerful and wealthy, needed royal patronage to maintain their temples. Thutmose's prophecy wasn't just mystical, it was a deal with theological stakeholders. And it worked spectacularly. His reign, though relatively short, marked a golden age. Military campaigns succeeded, monuments rose, and the stela itself became a pilgrimage site. Later pharaohs, including Ramses the Great, would mimic this tactic, using divine visions to cement their rule. The irony, the very sands the Sphinx begged to escape eventually buried the stela too, until modern archaeologists dug it up, proving that some prophecies, whether spun by gods or kings, have a habit of resurfacing when we least expect them. What lingers isn't just the question of whether the dream was real, but why it resonates. Thutmose's story reveals a timeless truth: power often wears the mask of destiny. Whether carved on stone or whispered in dreams, the prophecies that shape history aren't always predictions. Sometimes they're the ultimate power move. Centuries before the first Christian cross touched Irish soil, the Druids of Erin whispered of a coming change, a man who would extinguish the sacred fires and bring a new light from across the sea. Their prophecy, preserved in oral tradition and later recorded in medieval texts like the Book of Armagh, described a figure so precisely matching St. Patrick that even skeptical historians paused. The Druids spoke of a foreigner once enslaved in their land who would return with strange words and unshakable conviction. They warned their high king that this man would bind Ireland with chains of iron, not literal shackles but the unbreakable bonds of faith. What makes this prophecy so compelling is its eerie alignment with Patrick's own account in his confession. He wrote of dreaming that the Irish people called him back to the island where he'd once herded sheep in bondage. The Druid's vision of a man with a shepherd's staff speaking the language of angels mirrors Patrick's self-description as a humble pastor wielding not weapons but scripture. Even the timing fits. The prophecy placed the stranger's arrival when the oak and the yew debate. a possible reference to the clash between Druidic nature worship and the Christian message Patrick carried. But the real tension lies in how the prophecy played out. Legend says the High King Leghair's Druids tried to stop Patrick at the Hill of Tara, hurling curses and illusions. Yet every attempt failed, a detail that echoes older tales where prophets warned that no magic would touch the bringer of the new god. Patrick's famous bonfire on Easter night, defying the king's decree against lighting flames before the pagan festival, fulfilled another layer of the prediction. He will kindle a fire that burns but does not consume. The brilliance of this prophecy, though, is its ambiguity. The Druids didn't frame Patrick as a villain but as an inevitable force of transformation. Some modern scholars suggest their visions may have been metaphorical, recognizing that Ireland's isolation couldn't last forever, that contact with Rome's crumbling empire would reshape their world. Others argue the prophecy was retroactively applied by Christian scribes to legitimize Patrick's mission. Yet even if later embellished, the story's power endures because it captures a profound truth. The moment when one age gives way to another is never accidental. It's written sometimes in scripture, sometimes in song, and sometimes in the warnings of those who sense their world is about to turn. What lingers today isn't just the question of whether the Druids truly foresaw Patrick, but how their prophecy shaped his reception. By casting him as a foretold figure rather than a foreign invader, it softened Ireland's conversion, making Christianity feel less like conquest and more like destiny fulfilled. The same land that once raised standing stones to pagan gods would soon cover itself in monasteries, becoming the unlikely guardian of Western learning through the Dark Ages. Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of this prophecy. Sometimes the future doesn't just arrive, it's welcomed. High in the Andes, where the air grows thin and the condors circle, the Inca Empire stood as the greatest civilization the Americas had ever seen until a single prophecy tore it apart from within. Years before Spanish boots ever touched South American soil, royal oracles began whispering of a coming catastrophe. Brother will war against brother, and the blood of the sons of Inti will water the stones of Cusco. At the time, the warning seemed unthinkable. The Inca ruled an empire stretching 2,000 miles, with terraced farms feeding millions and roads uniting mountain peaks to coastal deserts. But the gods, it seemed, had already written their fate. The spark came with the death of Emperor Huayna Capac in 1527, likely from smallpox brought by early European contact. With no clear succession plan, his sons Atahualpa and Huascar plunged the empire into civil war. Priests later claimed this very conflict had been foretold in temple visions, a great rending that would leave the empire vulnerable to men with faces like the moon. The war raged for 5 brutal years, draining resources, decimating the army, and fracturing loyalties. By the time Francisco Pizarro arrived in 1532 with his handful of conquistadors, the Inca were already a shadow of their former strength. What makes this prophecy so haunting isn't just its accuracy, but its cruel irony. The oracles hadn't predicted foreign invasion, they'd warned of self-destruction. Atahualpa, fresh from defeating Huascar, marched into Pizarro's trap at Cajamarca with a divided force. His elite warriors, exhausted from years of fighting their own kin, were slaughtered in the square. The gold-filled ransom rooms, the very wealth that might have funded resistance, became symbols of a kingdom already gutted by greed. Even the sacred city of Cusco, where priests had once read the prophecy aloud, fell not to Spanish steel, but to the alliances Pizarro forged with Inca factions still bitter from the civil war. Yet there's a deeper layer to this tragedy. Some scholars argue the prophecy wasn't mystical foresight, but political maneuvering. The Inca state relied on oracles to legitimize power. What if priestly castes, seeing Huayna Capac's looming death, used divine warnings to influence succession? The war between brothers didn't just fulfill prophecy, it may have been engineered by it. Either way, the result was the same: a fractured empire that collapsed under its own weight, leaving Pizarro to walk through a door the Inca themselves had broken open. The lesson here isn't about supernatural prediction, it's about the cost of division. The Spanish didn't conquer the Inca, they exploited a crack that had already split the empire in two. And perhaps that's the real power of this prophecy. It reminds us that the greatest threats often come not from outside, but from within. When brother turns against brother, even gods can't stop the fall. Long before the concept of a Messiah entered the world's religious imagination, the ancient Persians were already whispering about a coming savior, one who would rise from the waters to cleanse the earth of darkness. The Zoroastrian prophecy of the Saoshyant, meaning the one who brings benefit, dates back over 3,000 years, etched into the sacred texts of the Avesta with startling clarity. This wasn't just a vague hope for deliverance, it was a detailed vision of a cosmic showdown between light and shadow, where a divine figure would emerge to resurrect the dead, purify creation, and usher in an eternal age of truth. What's astonishing isn't just the prophecy's endurance, it's how deeply it seeped into the DNA of later faiths, from Judaism's Messiah to Christianity's Christ. The Saoshyant's origin story alone reads like a blueprint for future messianic tales. According to Zoroastrian tradition, he would be born of a virgin, or in some versions, conceived from the seed of the prophet Zoroaster himself, preserved in a mystical lake. When the world's corruption reached its peak, this chosen one would rise from those waters, wielding a weapon not of steel but of divine words. Sound familiar? The parallels to later narratives are impossible to ignore. Even the Saoshyant's role as a judge, separating the righteous from the wicked in a final reckoning, mirrors themes in Christianity's Book of Revelation and Islam's Yawm al-Qiyamah. But here's where Zoroastrianism's prophecy stands apart, its emphasis on human agency. The Saoshyant isn't just a solitary hero, he's the culmination of generations of human effort. Followers of Ahura Mazda, the god of light, believe every act of goodness, every battle against lies and decay helps pave the way for the Savior's arrival. This idea of cosmic collaboration, where mortals and the divine work together to heal the world, would later echo in Jewish teachings about Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and even in modern movements for social justice. The prophecy wasn't passive, it was a call to action. The historical ripple effects are just as compelling. When Cyrus the Great freed the Jewish exiles from Babylon in the 6th century B.C., Zoroastrian and Jewish thinkers began exchanging ideas during Persia's rule over the region. Scholars trace concepts like heaven and hell, angelic hierarchies, and even Satan as a distinct adversary back to this cultural cross-pollination. By the time Jesus preached in Galilee, the theological soil had been tilled by centuries of Persian influence, making the Saoshyant prophecy perhaps one of history's most influential unseen forces. Yet the most haunting aspect of this ancient prediction isn't its impact on other religions, but its uncanny resilience. Even today, Zoroastrians in Mumbai and Tehran watch for signs of the Saoshyant's coming, believing he'll appear when the world teeters on the brink. In an era of climate crises and global unrest, that belief feels less like ancient mysticism and more like a timeless reminder. The hope for a redeemer isn't just about salvation. It's about the stubborn human conviction that no darkness lasts forever. The Saoshyant's fingerprints can be found in the most sacred texts of the world's major religions, woven so deeply into their theology that most never realize they're standing on Persian ground. Take Christianity's Book of Revelation, where a radiant Messiah returns to conquer evil and establish 1,000 years of peace, a scene nearly identical to Zoroastrian visions of the Saoshyant leading the final battle against Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction. Even the imagery overlaps. Both figures wield divine fire to purify the earth, both resurrect the dead, and both signal the dawn of an eternal paradise. The early church fathers would have encountered these ideas through Persia's cultural reach, from trade routes to the shared intellectual spaces of the ancient Near East. Islam, too, carries echoes of this ancient prophecy. The Quran's depiction of Judgment Day, where souls are weighed on scales of justice, mirrors the Zoroastrian concept of the Chinvat Bridge, a narrow passage where deeds determine one's fate. The Mahdi, Shia Islam's awaited redeemer, shares the Sayyid's role as a restorer of divine justice, appearing at history's darkest hour to vanquish oppression. Some scholars argue these parallels aren't coincidence but the result of centuries of exchange along the Silk Road, where Persian thinkers and Arab traders traded stories as readily as spices. Even beyond Abrahamic faiths, the Sayyid's DNA surfaces in unexpected places. Buddhism's Maitreya, the future Buddha who will return to renew spiritual truth, embodies a similar promise of deliverance. Hindu scriptures speak of Kalki, a warrior avatar who arrives on a white horse to cleanse the world, strikingly close to Zoroastrian descriptions of the Sayyid riding forth to battle darkness. These recurring motifs suggest something profound. The human longing for a redeemer isn't tied to one culture or era. It's a universal response to the fear that chaos might win and the hope that light eventually breaks through. What makes the Sayyid prophecy uniquely powerful is its adaptability. Unlike rigid predictions tied to specific times or places, its core themes, justice, renewal, the triumph of good, transcend boundaries. When Jewish exiles in Babylon encountered Zoroastrian ideas during Persian rule, they reshaped their own messianic expectations, blending them with older Hebrew traditions. Early Christians, writing in a Roman Empire steeped in Persian-influenced mystery cults, framed Jesus' resurrection with imagery that would have felt familiar to initiates of Mithraism, another faith born under Persia's shadow. The real test of any prophecy isn't just its accuracy, but its ability to inspire across millennia. By that measure, the Sayyid stands among history's most enduring visions. Today, as climate activists speak of saving the world and technologists promise utopian futures, we're still chasing that same ancient dream, the belief that someone or something will guide us out of the darkness. Whether that savior comes from heaven, a lab, or collective human effort, the essence remains unchanged. The Sayyid's greatest legacy isn't in scripture alone, but in the unshakable human conviction that endings can also be beginnings. Even as the wooden gates of Troy stood unbreached after 9 years of war, the city's fate had already been etched into history, not by the gods, but by their own refusal to heed the Delphic oracle's chilling warning. Beware the gift that walks, the priests had cautioned when Trojan scouts first spotted the Greeks' abandoned camp and the massive wooden horse left behind. At the time, it must have seemed like nonsense. What harm could a statue bring? But the oracle wasn't speaking in riddles that day. She was issuing a survival manual in 6 words, one the Trojans would ignore at their peril. Archaeology now confirms just how meticulously this prophecy played out. Excavations at Hisarlik, the modern site of ancient Troy, reveal a city that fell not by force but by misplaced trust. The oracle's mention of the gift that walks wasn't poetic flourish, it was a literal description. Recent studies of ancient naval engineering suggest the horse likely stood on hidden wheels, allowing it to be dragged into the city as if by divine will. The Trojans, interpreting its abandonment as a sign of Greek surrender, never considered that hollow belly might carry something far deadlier than wood. But the real tragedy lies in the moments before destruction. Cassandra, Troy's cursed prophetess, tore her hair and screamed warnings as the horse loomed over the gates. Her visions, dismissed as madness, precisely foreshadowed what was coming. Iron in the womb, fire in the night. Sure enough, when the moon rose, Greek soldiers emerged from the horse's belly like parasites from a host, slaughtering guards and flinging open the city's defenses. Charred layers in Troy's ruins tell the rest of the story, not just a sacking, but an inferno that consumed everything. The oracle hadn't just predicted the horse, she'd outlined the entire domino effect of arrogance and oversight. What makes this prophecy so enduring isn't just its accuracy, but its lesson. Troy didn't fall because the Greeks were stronger. It fell because the Trojans, in their moment of triumph, forgot the oldest rule of survival. When the gods send a warning, it's not for decoration. And as the ashes cooled, the irony would have been palpable. The very walls they thought made them invincible became the cage that trapped them, just as the oracle had foreseen, and just as history would never forget. For the Lakota people, the birth of a white buffalo calf isn't just a rare genetic event. It's the fulfillment of a sacred prophecy, one that speaks to the very survival of the earth. The legend, passed down through generations, tells of a time when chaos and greed would push the world to the brink. In that darkness, the white buffalo calf woman, a spiritual being who first brought the Lakota their sacred pipe and teachings, promised to return. Her sign, the birth of a white buffalo, its coat as pure as snow, signaling the dawn of a new era. What makes this prophecy so compelling isn't just its spiritual weight, but the eerie timing of its modern manifestations. In 1994, a white buffalo named Miracle was born in Janesville, Wisconsin, an event so statistically improbable, geneticists estimated the odds at 1 in 10 million. For the Lakota and other indigenous nations, this wasn't just biology. It was a wake-up call. Miracle's birth coincided with a growing global awareness of environmental crises, from deforestation to climate change, mirroring the prophecy's warning of a world out of balance. Even more striking, the calf's coat slowly darkened over time, precisely as foretold in the legend, symbolizing the gradual restoration of harmony. But the prophecy's real power lies in its specificity. The white buffalo calf woman didn't just promise a sign, she outlined its meaning. The birth would herald a choice: continue on the path of destruction, or embrace renewal through respect for the earth and one another. This duality resonates deeply today. In 2012, another white buffalo named Lightning Medicine Cloud was born in Texas, only to die mysteriously weeks later. Some saw tragedy, others interpreted it as a warning, a reminder that prophecies aren't guarantees but calls to action. The births keep coming. Over 30 documented white buffaloes have appeared since Miracle, each met with pilgrimages and ceremonies. Skeptics dismiss them as mere albino anomalies, but for those who hold the old ways, the message is undeniable. The prophecy speaks of a time when the rivers will run clear again and the hearts of the people will mend. In an era of water protectors and ecological activism, that vision feels less like mysticism and more like a roadmap. Perhaps the most profound lesson here is one of responsibility. Unlike passive predictions, the white buffalo prophecy demands participation. It doesn't promise salvation, it offers a chance if we're brave enough to take it. The calves keep coming. The question is, are we listening? Ancient Hindu scriptures speak of a cosmic cycle, 4 great ages spiraling endlessly from enlightenment to dissolution and back again. The last of these, the Kali Yuga, was predicted to be an age of shadows, a time when virtue would wither, truth would fade, and society would teeter on the brink of collapse. What's startling isn't just the prophecy's existence, but how meticulously our modern world mirrors its descriptions. The Vishnu Purana, written over 2,000 years ago, paints the Kali Yuga with eerie precision. Rulers will become greedy and corrupt, taking wealth rather than protecting their people. Families will fracture, and sacred bonds will dissolve into self-interest. The earth will be exploited until her rivers run dry and her skies grow dark. Look around and the parallels are unsettling. The texts warned of a time when falsehood wears the mask of truth, where deception spreads like wildfire. Today's era of deepfakes and viral disinformation fits that vision to the letter. They spoke of short-lived men chasing shorter pleasures, a possible nod to our obsession with instant gratification and shrinking attention spans. Even environmental devastation was foreseen. The Mahabharata describes forests stripped bare, mountains hollowed for minerals, and air thick with poison. a landscape any climate scientist would recognize. But here's where the prophecy cuts deepest: its psychological insights. The Kali Yuga wasn't just about external chaos, it diagnosed a sickness of the soul. Ancient seers predicted that in this age, spirituality would become transactional, religion reduced to donations, wisdom to memorized slogans, and enlightenment to a fashion. Walk through any modern city and you'll see it. Meditation apps marketed like gym memberships, sacred symbols stamped on coffee mugs, the endless commodification of the divine. The texts even foresaw the erosion of trust, warning that no teacher, no leader, no parent will be spared suspicion. In an age of conspiracy theories and collapsing institutions, that line feels less like prophecy and more like a headline. Yet within this bleak vision lies a startling twist. The Kali Yuga was always meant to be the crucible for transformation. The same texts that predicted decay also promised rebirth, comparing this age to the darkest hour before dawn. When hypocrisy reigns and the greedy rule, one passage reads, "The seeds of the next golden age take root." That duality, the recognition that crisis can be both end and beginning, might be the prophecy's most enduring gift. After all, every broken system exposes its flaws, and every collapse clears space for something new. Perhaps that's why these ancient warnings still resonate. They don't just diagnose despair, they contextualize it. The Kali Yuga wasn't a death sentence, it was a challenge, an invitation to recognize decay and choose differently. And in that sense, these texts offer something rare among prophecies, not a fixed future but a mirror. The age of darkness is here, just as foretold. But the next turn of the cycle, that part's still ours to write. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon woke in a cold sweat, his mind racing with fragments of a dream he couldn't fully grasp, a vision so vivid yet so fleeting it left him trembling. Desperate for answers, he summoned every wise man, sorcerer, and astrologer in his kingdom, demanding not just an interpretation, but proof they could be trusted. "Tell me the dream itself," he commanded, "then reveal its meaning." When the mystics faltered, a young Hebrew exile named Daniel stepped forward, claiming his God could unveil mysteries no mortal could fathom. What followed wasn't just a display of divine insight, it was a prophecy so precise it would map out the next 5 centuries of world empires with chilling accuracy. Daniel described the king's dream in vivid detail: a colossal statue with a head of gold, chest of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of mixed iron and clay. Then a stone cut not by human hands struck the statue's feet, reducing the entire structure to dust before growing into a mountain that filled the earth. To modern readers, this might sound like surreal imagery, but Daniel's interpretation grounded it in startling historical reality. The golden head, Babylon itself at the peak of its wealth and power. The silver torso, the Medo-Persian Empire that would conquer Babylon just decades later. The bronze belly, Greece under Alexander the Great, whose armies would topple Persia. And the iron legs, Rome, the empire famed for its unbreakable military might. But it's the feet of iron and clay that make this prophecy truly uncanny. Daniel warned this final kingdom would be both strong and brittle, a dual nature echoed in Rome's eventual division into Eastern and Western empires, one robust, the other crumbling. The stone that destroys the statue, scholars debate whether it symbolizes Christ's kingdom or a divine revolution, but its impact is clear: earthly powers, no matter how glorious, are fleeting. What's remarkable isn't just the prophecy's accuracy, but its defiance of probability. Daniel didn't vaguely predict a sequence of kingdoms. He named their very metals, mirroring historical shifts in weaponry and currency, from Babylon's gold coins to Rome's iron discipline. The deeper genius lies in the dream's timing. Nebuchadnezzar ruled at Babylon's zenith with no visible threats to his reign. For Daniel to predict its fall and the rise of empires not yet born required either divine foresight or an understanding of human patterns we're only now recognizing. Modern historians note how each predicted empire followed the same trajectory: wealth leading to complacency, complacency to vulnerability. The statue's downward progression, from gold to clay, wasn't just prophecy, it was a commentary on the inevitable decay of unchecked power. Yet the dream's real power wasn't in predicting collapse, but in offering hope beyond it. The mountain filling the earth suggests something enduring rising from the ruins. For exiled Hebrews like Daniel, that promise meant more than any empire's glory. It whispered that no matter how mighty kingdoms appear, history isn't theirs to control. And perhaps that's why this prophecy still resonates, not just as ancient prediction, but as a reminder that the stones which shatter empires often come from places the powerful never think to look. For 250 years, Japan's shores remained closed to the outside world, a deliberate isolation enforced by the Tokugawa shogunate with ruthless precision. No foreign ships could dock, no outsiders could enter, and no Japanese could leave under penalty of death. Yet hidden within the archives of Edo period mystics lies a prophecy so precise, it's as if the future itself slipped through the shogun's iron grip. Decades before Commodore Matthew Perry's black-hulled warship steamed into Tokyo Bay, an obscure Buddhist monk named Nikko Shonin penned a warning. When the iron dragons vomit smoke and the sea turns black with their shadows, the land of the rising sun will awaken to a new dawn. At the time, the shogunate dismissed such visions as superstition. Japan's policy of sakoku, locked country, had kept Western influence at bay since the 1600s. But the prophecy's details were unsettlingly specific. The monk spoke of ships without sails, powered by fire, a near-perfect description of Perry's steam-powered vessels. Even the timing aligned. The prediction placed the event during the Year of the Tiger, and Perry's fleet arrived in 1853, the Year of the Water Tiger in the Japanese zodiac. What makes this prophecy so compelling isn't just its accuracy, but the cultural earthquake it foreshadowed. The arrival of the black ships didn't just end isolation. It shattered Japan's feudal hierarchy, toppled the shogunate, and sparked the Meiji Restoration, a revolution that transformed a medieval society into a modern industrial power in mere decades. The monk's vision of a new dawn wasn't metaphorical. It was a roadmap for a nation forced to choose between adaptation and extinction. Yet the real mystery lies in how these predictions persisted in popular imagination. Woodblock prints from the era show villagers gathering on cliffs, pointing at Perry's ships with a mix of terror and recognition, as if they'd known this moment was coming all along. Some scholars argue the prophecy became a self-fulfilling script, priming the Japanese people to accept radical change as destiny rather than defeat. Others note that Buddhist cosmology, with its cycles of destruction and renewal, naturally framed upheaval as inevitable, but the most haunting detail. The prophecy didn't stop with Perry's arrival. It hinted at a future where Japan would master the iron dragons and ride the storm westward. Within 50 years, Japan did exactly that, defeating Russia in 1905, the first Asian nation to conquer a European power in modern history. The monk's words weren't just a warning, they were a challenge, one that echoed across generations. When the black ships came, Japan didn't crumble, it awakened just as foretold. The moment those black-hulled warships breached Japan's coastal waters, the prophecy's weight crashed down like a tidal wave. Commodore Perry didn't just bring steam engines and cannons, he carried the irreversible future the monk had warned of centuries earlier. The shogunate, paralyzed by the sight of ships that defied wind and tide, faced an impossible choice: fight a losing battle or surrender to the inevitable. Their decision to open Japan's ports in 1854 didn't just end isolation, it triggered a domino effect that would rewrite the nation's DNA. Within 15 years, the Tokugawa shogunate collapsed, its rigid feudal order shattered like brittle clay. But here's where the prophecy's deeper layers emerged. The monk hadn't just foreseen foreign invasion, he'd hinted at Japan's metamorphosis. master the iron dragons, those cryptic words urged, and that's precisely what happened. The Meiji Restoration wasn't a surrender, it was a revolution. Young samurai, once bound by sword and status, became statesmen and industrialists. Factories sprouted where rice paddies once lay, and by 1872, Japan had its first railway, stitching together a nation leaping centuries ahead in a single generation. The prophecy's most striking fulfillment, though, lay in Japan's psychological pivot. Ride the storm westward, the monk had declared, a command that took literal form in 1904 when Admiral Togo's fleet annihilated the Russian Navy at Tsushima. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power humbled a European empire, proving Japan hadn't just adapted to the New World Order, it had mastered it. The same black ships that symbolized humiliation in 1853 became blueprints for Japan's own imperial navy, turning prophecy into an engine of national reinvention. Yet the true brilliance of the monk's vision was its ambiguity. He hadn't predicted doom but transformation. When Perry's squadron departed, they left behind more than treaties, they left a mirror. Japan saw its reflection in those iron hulls and recognized a choice: cling to the past or forge a new identity. The prophecy's power wasn't in its inevitability, but in its invitation, a challenge to meet the future not with fear but with ruthless reinvention. And in that lesson lies its enduring resonance. The future belongs not to those who resist change, but to those who dare to steer it. From Alexander the Great's rise foretold at Delphi to the Hopi's warning of the blue star Kachina, these 25 prophecies share one haunting thread, an uncanny precision that defies simple coincidence. Each one, whether carved into clay tablets or whispered by shamans, didn't just predict the future, it seemed to shape it, guiding emperors to power, civilizations to ruin, and ordinary moments into history. The oracles of Delphi didn't offer vague horoscopes, they sketched Alexander's conquests down to the slicing of the Gordian knot. The Mayans didn't just fear invaders, they described Spanish armor and horses centuries before Europeans set foot in the Americas. And Nostradamus, his quatrain about London's Great Fire, wasn't just eerie poetry. It nailed the year, the duration, even the ashes left in its wake. But here's the real mystery: are these prophecies proof of divine vision or something else entirely? Some scholars argue they're masterpieces of cold reading vague enough to fit multiple events, sharpened by hindsight. Others point to pattern recognition, the human brain's knack for stitching meaning from chaos. After all, civilizations rise and fall in cycles. Predict enough wars and famines, and eventually you'll hit the mark. Yet how do we explain prophecies like Cyrus the Great's liberation of the Jews, foretold by name in the book of Isaiah a century before his birth, or the Tibetan texts that described airplanes as iron birds long before the Wright brothers took flight? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. These ancient seers weren't just fortune tellers, they were keen observers of human nature, politics, and the cosmos. The Sibylline Books didn't merely predict Rome's wars with Carthage. They reflected the fragile balance of power, the inevitability of conflict when empires collide. The Kali Yuga's warnings of societal decay weren't magic. They were insights into the consequences of greed and neglect, timeless truths dressed in myth. Maybe prophecy isn't about seeing the future, but understanding the forces that shape it, the patterns that repeat across millennia. Or maybe, just maybe, there's more to this world than we've yet uncovered. Could the Hopi have tapped into a collective consciousness? Did the Norse sense climate collapse in their bones long before satellites tracked melting ice? Whatever the truth, these prophecies challenge us to look beyond the surface of history, to see the threads connecting past, present, and future in ways we're still struggling to comprehend. So what do you think? Divine insight, brilliant guesswork, or something we haven't even named yet? Drop your theories in the comments. We'll be diving into even more historical enigmas in future videos. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to join us as we unravel the world's greatest mysteries, one prophecy at a time. After all, the next revelation might be closer than you think.